Well, let me, without further ado, introduce our speaker tonight, who is Professor Ian White over here. He's currently Master of Jesus College, amongst many other things, including being a Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University, Professor of Engineering, Head of the Photonic Research Group in the Engineering Department here. And we're really fortunate to have him because actually next spring he's going off to be Vice-Chancellor of Bath University, which was one of his old haunts. I think he was Professor of Physics there in 1990 to 96, something like that, before he went to Bristol. So he's sort of going back home. So we're really fortunate to have him. His research has been in the area of high-speed communication systems, so I guess it's something that all of us benefit from when we're tapping away on our computers in some way or the other, the transmission of information. But besides all that stuff, he's also a Christian. In fact, he's a member of this church, I believe. I think he was even once church warden here, weren't you? Which he loves taking on responsibilities, which lots of us prefer not to. He's very well qualified indeed to talk about his topic tonight, which is scientific life for the Christian. So, Ian, please come and tell us about that.
Well, Bob, thank you very much indeed for your very kind words. And may I actually say at this juncture how privileged I feel to be able to say thank you to the Faraday Institute. I think that the work that the Institute has done over the years and the work that its members did before that time in bringing so much understanding to so many Christians and others about the interplay between science and religion has been so important. And with the launch of the Institute in 2006, I think it was, with support of the Templeton, and the fact that it's just become an independent charity, I would like to thank you for the wonderful ministry that you, Bob, others have done. It's made a great deal of difference to me, and I'd like to thank you so much. Indeed, actually, I have to say, I do feel a little bit awkward here. There's a very well-known story in Ireland of a lady attending the funeral of her husband, who was so astonished by the comments that the priest came out during the sermon that she asked her son just to make sure that the coffin had the right body in it. And I have to say, I do really, at some extent, feel somewhat of a fraud in that I don't really regard myself as a proper scientist, despite, as Bob says, having held a chair in the past. And so speaking on the scientific life of the Christian, my wife takes really the claim as being the scientist in the family, having studied it here, though she really loves commenting on how she felt she was non-natural rather than a natural one. Indeed, one of my early recollections of coming to Cambridge as a student was the ways in which engineers and natural scientists were often in quite different groups. And I've since enjoyed the various attempts to define the difference. A most recent example for me being encapsulated in the statement that the difference between an engineer and the scientist is that the former wants to be rich while the latter wants to be famous, though I'm aware that these days there are quite a few that would argue it's the other way around. For much of my life, of course, the contrasts between science and engineering have received little attention compared with those relating to science and religion. And in particular, when I was young, I was acutely aware of the debate concerning the validity of Christian belief in the face of scientific advance, with some scientists making statements such as, although they were not as clever as God, they were as clever as he was when he was their age. However, in part due to the witness of Christians, scientists and others, the battle between science and religion has never really had the greatest substance for me. I have to be honest about that. Not that I was immune to the arguments. It was rather that they weren't part of the origins and core of my faith. For me, faith began when I was young. I grew up in a Christian family, and coming to faith was more about realizing the need for commitment rather than taking a clear decision to reverse what I previously had believed. I was encouraged throughout my childhood at church to focus on the life of Christ, his death, resurrection, absolution for sin, and resulting joy of everlasting life. And for me, focusing on Christ's life, particularly his life on earth, gave a focus to faith. Did Christ die? Did he rise from the dead? Did he ascend to heaven? And if those answers were yes, should his promise of eternal life on the basis of our repentance be taken as truth? And for me, that was clearly an answer yes also. And to be honest, my faith has maintained that level of simplicity. Interestingly, probably when I was young indeed, it was the influence on my faith at school that surpassed my church in some ways, not least because of the role, unusually, the school played in my prayer life. This happened because when I was a very young boy in my secondary school, the senior pupils, a group of them, went off to as part of the Christian Union for a weekend. And one boy, stepping off the school bus, got hit at high speed by a car. The following week, the Christians gathered together, and initially the teacher said, well, he was unlikely to last the week. And then it was agreed, well, we just start praying every break time. And as you might guess, the story went on, well, yes, he'll probably last a few more weeks, and then, yes, he'll probably come round in a while, but the coma that he's been in will have happened for such a long time that he'll be permanently incapacitated. And the interesting thing was, as that prayer built up, we started praying for other things as well. So by the time the chap actually came back to take a CU event in college, about 2 years, the Christian group had doubled in size. Indeed, by the time I left school, it constituted about half the senior school. It was a fascinating time because actually what impressed me was not really so much the recovery of a student, but rather the transformation of lives around me, those who joined the CU as the years went by. And this was really the outworking of the prayer. That outworking occurred within me and around me. And then Cambridge, coming here, was such a formative event. And actually, I've got some key people here I've noticed tonight that I should be thanking. My chaplain, James Atwell, who was very helpful to me in college. And there was one person, I don't know if you've come across him, a chap called Keith Fox, who was the head of my Christian Union, I remember, when I was a mere fresher. So the KICU was an interesting organisation from the science-religion divide. As counterintuitively for some, at the time, KICU had a large majority of scientists, engineers, and medics. And in part, this was due to God using some wonderful ministry by leading scientists who showed Christian truth not only in words, but also in their lives. In part, it was due to the evangelistic message being centered on Christ, as I've just described. And also, I think, because at the time, many scientists did not find it difficult to feel that scientific knowledge had limits, and that speculating what was beyond those known limits rapidly became not a matter of science, but of faith, something that I will comment on later, because as I feel it's less clear today. We were exceptionally fortunate to have had some scientists whose insights on the science and religion debate really were so important to me in strengthening their faith. And there were different levels to this for me. At the simplest, I well remember the then Master of Jesus College, Sir Alan Cottrell, an outstanding material scientist, in many ways transformed teaching of the subject in Cambridge. When asked when he believed in God, and actually I think it was in James's room, very simply saying, well, I'm here, so someone's put me here, so yes, I believe in God. But I'm also so very grateful for the work of some present tonight who've helped deepen my faith by understanding much more clearly the scientific context in which events in the Bible have occurred, explanations of miracles, insights into how the Bible writers have written about scientific or miraculous events, or indeed how current trends in science should be thought about from a faith perspective. It's been so important to me to allow me to relate to the Bible much more, and to be yet in much greater wonder about the power of God. that scientific work, for me, has made me feel that we need God more, not less. And in times I've even seen it on my own work. I remember well the time we were doing work on generating very short optical pulses using lasers. And I realized that the optical pulse that we were generating was about as short as a minute to the as a minute was to the currently predicted age of the universe by most scientists. It was interesting, particularly from an engineering perspective, because of course the pulse was far too long in our view. We wanted it far shorter. And so as a result, I had this huge awareness that the universe actually wasn't that old. And actually, there's much more out beyond it. Of course, all that was some time ago. And science has advanced hugely since then. And it's meant that some see science as all-powerful, and it being just a matter of time before it mops out belief. However, if I look over the years in my life, I've been surprised how, yes, science has advanced hugely, but in certain ways only, and in other fields, actually, it's not struggled to go beyond the areas that we thought it would. For example, my own research area, it's been a joy to see how physical understanding of those lasers has meant that they've gone from a stage where I remember the first green laser I ever saw was wonderful. It was in a bottle of liquid nitrogen, and we were all very excited, and we pulled the thing out, and we saw the green light last for a good 3 seconds before the laser disintegrated, whereas nowadays you take it for granted in your CD players and your DVD players, and they're expected to run, actually in some cases, at 200 degrees C. Oh, since I was a student, and I assure you I'm not that old, optical communication systems have grown about 10 million times in performance. And indeed, a friend in engineering here has calculated that in excess of 80% of all papers in electrical engineering, and arguably, I would happily argue this, 80% of the knowledge has happened since I was a student. And yet, still after all these years, we've not been able to do very basic things like make a laser which tunes in a very simple way right across the whole optical spectrum in a very compact form because of fundamental materials properties. Something that I would have really expected us to do now. And so, although many rightly foresee science rapidly advancing into the spiritual domain, and I understand why that is, I also know what it's like for science to get stuck. And that's actually strengthened my attitude to faith and acted as a balance to the all-powerful approach. There are also, interestingly for me, increasingly mixed messages these days about science in the general public. When as I was young, still benefiting somewhat from the role that science played in the UK in World War II, many believed the advances in the 60s and 70s in science were extremely important. Yes, there were concerns, great concerns, for example, about nuclear war, but there was little debate about whether scientific results were right or true, these being accepted to be the result of a rigorous and reviewed or validated process. Scientific truth was a relatively straightforward and accepted principle. And today it is interesting to see how there are parallels but also differences. It's lovely to see how, for example, the IT revolution has been seen by some to bring great economic benefit. For example, in Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, who said something special has happened to the American economy in recent years. An economy that 20 years ago, I remember it because I've quite a few American relatives, and I remember when I was younger, many talking about how for the first time they thought their children would be poorer than them, something that never had happened in the US before. An economy, as Greenspan said, that seemed to have seen its better days, is displaying a remarkable run of economic growth that appears to have its roots in ongoing advances of technology. I've hypothesized on a number of occasions that the synergy that have developed, especially among the microprocessor, laser, fiber optics and satellite technologies, have dramatically raised the potential rates of return on all types of equipment that embody or utilize these newer technologies. But times are changing. For example, there is a view which I have an element of sympathy with currently, that some of the financial challenges we face globally is not because of too much scientific advance, but too little. That the IT revolution is now somewhat old, and that the newer real scientific technologies have not yet been able to generate equivalent rates of return. There's also an interestingly different moral and ethical view of science today, one that questions whether its advances are leading to real truth, or whether at least some purported discoveries, particularly those which lead to certain future predictions, are closer to the conventional sense of belief than of science. New advances, particularly in biological sciences and AI, are leading some to question whether science has crossed into a place where ethical issues are much more complex, and whether it's leading us into new social structures which are not in the common good. With the impact of IT, fake and reliable news is much harder to disentangle, as are the resulting ethical issues. Such sentiments have regularly been the case over history, but it does seem to me that they're particularly strong now. And so why am I saying this in an event such as this? Well, because it's something into which Christian perspective, as is being done through the Faraday Institute and by many others here, can bring real benefit. And I do congratulate you, because I do believe that now is a time when Christians have a real opportunity to witness. I'm delighted that there are people in this room, because of their faith in the Lord and their world-class scientific knowledge, can speak out to a world in a unique and powerful way to show how scientific practice should remain scientific, and how science should be careful to avoid straying into the spiritual or areas of belief. This, I do believe, is important, as I'm not sure that others speaking out can do with the same level of scholarship or wisdom. Of course, having mentioned the word in wisdom, it's interesting to ask how the scientific approach relates to, or in certain sections, differs from Christian wisdom. And may I close, therefore, by just focusing on one part of the Bible which deals with wisdom in a rather interesting way, in my view. Taking 2 Chronicles chapter 1. And if you'll forgive me, in a minute, I'll read part of it. This is the passage where, after considerable difficulty, Solomon has established himself on his throne. After Solomon makes sacrifices to God, thanking, God appears to him and says, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." And Solomon answers God, "You've shown great kindness to David, my father, and have made me king in his place. Now, Lord God, let your promise to my father David be confirmed, for you've made me king over a people who are as numerous as the dust of the earth. Give me wisdom and knowledge, that I may lead this people, for who is able to govern this great people of yours?" God responds, "Since this is your heart's desire, and you've not asked for wealth, possessions, or honor, or for the death of your enemies, and you've not asked for a long life, but for wisdom and knowledge to govern my people over whom I have made you king, therefore wisdom and knowledge will be given you. And I will also give you wealth, possessions, and honor, such as no king who was before you ever had, and none after you will have." I find this an amazing passage. Here we have Solomon having accepted, if you'll forgive my use of language, a throne with a real poison chalice. Remember, he was the son of Bathsheba, whose husband had been killed by David before she became his wife, the lowest points of David's reign. And in part as a result, and in part due to the strength of his kingdom, Solomon's rule started with key people, some of who were other sons of David, who would have been very happy to have had his throne. And it was a brutal time. And at that point, God asks, "Ask for whatever you want." Amazing. What would you have said? Money? Power? Victory? Death of enemies? health, long life. But no, Solomon, still really a boy, asks for wisdom, as wisdom comes from God. And of course, for the Christian, there's some very important messages here. Firstly, we don't create wisdom. We find or discover it. For the Christian, this is through our individual relation with God. What we do matters to Him. He loves us. And hence we matter in absolute ways as individuals. That concept of the sanctity of human life, which puts it above all others in creation. Secondly, as wisdom comes from God, it's both good and absolute. There actually is truth, which is good and absolute. For the Christian, one gets wisdom by looking to God. And I actually believe that in university, the focus across all subjects should be seeking truth and understanding first and foremost, and keeping focus on that. That actually is, of course, the universal approach which gave the university its name. Critical thought should exist within that context. And indeed, research should arise from scholarship. Something to me that seems at times to get lost with the pressures of REF, or the Research Effectiveness Framework, these days in universities. And even better than this, other things will fall into place when this approach to wisdom is taken. Indeed, it's fascinating when surprisingly Solomon asks for wisdom, so impressed, God throws in riches, wealth, honour, victory over, and indeed no king had or will have, has had wealth that surpassed Solomon. Also long life, victory over enemies. It's interesting because all these actually, even today, would typically be many people's greatest worries or goals. We can so easily worry about wealth. Will we have enough? About our position, our possessions, in Solomon's case, right at the heart of his identity. And also, of course, honour. A word not much used today, but actually a major driver for our university counselling in Cambridge. In modern terms, it would be our popularity or relationships. Whether our friends are giving us the credit that we are due, or we feel we deserve. Of course, a sensitive issue for many scientists. And of course, respect to us in our work, in our research, and for our contributions to that research. And for the Christian, the message is clear. If we really want to overcome our fears, wealth, possessions, honour, relationships, and health, we should seek wisdom. Indeed, we should seek to get closer to God when we want to be further from our fears. For the Christian scientists, therefore, there are big differences in approach to many without that same faith. We're living in a world where God is love and we, as human beings, are special. That matters, and above all, our personal witness is crucial. Our research is ultimately learning more about God, who is absolute and true, and that truth should be discovered, not invented, and indeed not extrapolated into other areas of belief. And therefore, our work should always find its place within our Christian journey, something that at times can be hard, particularly given the competitiveness in science these days. If we look to him, he will give us wisdom and so much more. Thank you very much.